Hi guys, my name is Mimi. I will be presenting today about the efforts taken to protect endemic species of Hawaii against invasive species, and this relates to the importance of ecology in conservation and management. So what are the negative effects of invasive species? First, we'll just do a quick debrief of what invasive species are, just because it's been some time. Invasive species are species that are introduced outside of their native range, whether it's intentionally or accidentally. And they basically establish themselves in this new ecosystem where then they cause negative impact on the ecosystem or nature and society. So a specific effect that invasive species can cause is actually the extinction of native species, the ones that were original to that ecosystem. And this can be through factors such as competition, through diseases, through other factors. And basically what you get is a decrease in native species biodiversity. And when this occurs, it can result in impact economic vitality. And this is really important in states such as Hawaii, where a predominant part of Hawaii's economy depends on tourism. So overall, invasive species are one of the leading drivers of biodiversity loss and habitat degradation in the world. So Hawaii, for a lot of conservationists and policymakers, is considered a model for managing invasive species. Why? Because Hawaii, as you know, is a series of islands, as seen here, and these islands are pretty much geographically isolated for the most part. It's surrounded by oceans, there's not a lot going in, and supposedly not a lot going out either. So Hawaii has a high rate of endemism, where a lot of the species that are native to them are indigenous to these islands. However, because of global commerce and importation, the introduction rate of non-native species is actually 50,000 times the natural background rate. And this results in Hawaii having a high level of richness of established non-native species. So you can have, well, as of 2020, there were counted 5,300 total established alien species, 300 to 500 of which were categorized as invasive. Obviously, there's probably a lot more now and yet to be discovered. So now we're going to go into the various control methods that Hawaii has used against invasive species that have worked and succeeded. The first thing we'll start off with is surveillance and prevention. So this involves the stage where your invasive species actually have not been developed or well developed in the ecosystem. There's just hints of them popping up here and there, but they haven't established themselves in the ecosystem yet. An example of this is the brown tree snake. So the brown tree snake actually established itself in Guam, where it became an invasive species and caused, unfortunately, a large loss in biodiversity, where in Guam there was 10 out of 13 native bird species that were completely extinct. On top of that, Guam experienced a lot of economic negative impact, where not only was there a loss of tourism, but there was also a lot of electrical power outages caused by these snakes. On top of that, of course, there are health risks from the snake bites. And so Hawaii is putting a lot of effort into surveillance to help prevent the migration or dispersal of the snake from potentially Guam to Hawaii. And these prevention efforts have been shown to save the state up to $2.4 billion annually in costs, which is pretty significant. Another method involves early detection. And early detection is similar to surveillance, but it involves the investment in trained personnel that actually goes into the field to detect early signs of invasion. So, for example, this axis deer with its distinct coat and antlers, these people will go in and be able to, pick out that these are new species that are likely able to invade Hawaii's ecosystem. And normally these are campaigns that involve coordination between multiple invasive species prevention groups. For Hawaii, it has been shown to work for the axis deer population, field chameleon population, and the small Indian mongoose population. So what happens if invasive species become well established? Well, surveillance doesn't work anymore, and for Hawaii, one of the methods they use is biocontrol. Biocontrol is recognized by conservationists as a critical tool for sustaining management of disruptive invaders. It's usually used agriculturally. These are just a list of the plants that have been successfully controlled via biocontrol in Hawaii. However, for Hawaii, with such high rates and high levels of invasive species, a lot of time when it comes to biocontrol, it's essential to prioritize the most damaging invaders, so the ones that cause maybe a lot more negative impact. Focus on those first before working down the line. Another method that has worked for Hawaii involves eradication of invasive mammals. It has been done as early as 1923, where hunters eradicated European rabbits. These rabbits, when they were introduced into Hawaii, ravaged all vegetation. They ate pretty much everything. And because of this, they caused the extinction of 22 local plants as well as 3 endemic native birds due to their habitat being degraded by these rabbits. Today, there's actually an ongoing eradication involving black and Polynesian rats, and they are doing this through aerial broadcasts of rodenticide, which is interesting. Don't know what the health risks are in terms of humans. It wasn't discussed, but it'll be interesting to research and find out. Another method that has worked for Hawaii involves construction of physical barriers. For example, here, this is an 8-kilometer cat fence that is located in Hawaii Volcano National Park. It's built to help protect seabird breeding populations. Seabirds used to be endangered in Hawaii. I'm not sure if they're still endangered or not, but they are essentially trying to repopulate this species. So these fences help block feral cats and ungulates, which are goats, sheep, and pigs, from entering ecologically important areas. And this fence is really well built. It has an overhanging hood, it's made out of fine mesh, and it has a bird skirt to help prevent these animals from digging through the other side. So now that we've talked about successes and what has worked for Hawaii, now we're going to talk about the challenges that Hawaii has faced in terms of conservation and management efforts, and then also potential solutions that have been in the works or being discussed. So for Hawaii, a major challenge is topography. Topography is challenging in Hawaii. There's a lot of steep rugged slopes and high elevations, and these areas provide refuge for invasive species away from where humans can generally reach. And potential solutions generally include development of new technologies, and this includes nighttime infrared cameras. There's something called the Airborne Visible and Infrared Imaging Spectrometer, which actually is used in the air via helicopter, and it basically can distinguish between reflecting signatures of native versus non-native trees, which is really cool. There's something called herbicide ballistic technology, where you shoot at individual weeds, invasive weeds, whether it's on the ground or the air. There's the self-resetting trap that removes 20 times the amount of rats compared to normal traps. There's also the underwater vacuum cleaner that helps to reduce invasive algae and coral reefs. Another challenge that is faced is legislation. Hawaii is actually one of the top areas in the world that has really made large advancements in terms of legislation against invasive species. There's the formation of Hawaii Invasive Species Council. There's this 10-year plan that they're involved in called the Hawaii Interagency Biosecurity Plan. And basically both of these have to do with invasive species management, research, and garnering public and governmental support. However, difficulties regarding legislation really has to do with private desires and economic interests conflicting with governmental actions. For example, there's disagreement over recreational hunting of large game animals, all of which are considered non-native to Hawaii. However, due to private interests, it's hard for the government to implement what is essentially what they want to do but can't do. On top of that, different organizations cover different areas. So the Hawaii Department of Agriculture really has control over only ports of entry versus the Department of Land and Natural Resources, which has control only pretty much in public spaces, so like parks and large open areas, not really residential areas where they would have to go in, ask permission in order to access the land in order to implement their invasive species control methods. Another issue, of course, is funding and resources, or lack of. When there is a lack of funding and resources, particularly manpower, there's a lack of ongoing monitoring. So it's difficult to then really determine the success of invasive species control or eradication. On top of that, it's difficult to really see what then becomes unforeseen long-term impacts of invasive species control methods. For example, removal of invasive pigs resulted in 5 times the density growth of invasive strawberry guava. So the takeaway here is that without monitoring, future evidence-based decisions on invasive species control are really difficult to make, if not impossible. Possible solutions that have been discussed, including establishing the BACI method as a standard. So this involves monitoring before an invasive species become established, after they are established, during when control methods are implemented, and then the impact of these control methods on these invasive species and whether or not other species are indirectly impacted as well. Another solution is actually imposing an arrival fee or hotel tax. And this not only might be able to increase funding, but also increase public awareness. Speaking of which, in Hawaii, for a lot of tourists and residents, there's a lack of recognition of the problems that are caused by invasive species. Unfortunately, a lot of people are moving to live in cities, and there's a strong disconnect with nature. And because of this, residents really can only identify a handful of well-known invasive species, and more than half can't even identify a single native forest bird. This lack of public awareness then results and translates to low priority for a lot of policymakers and government. There are more challenges, unfortunately. For example, some non-native species that are considered invasive in Hawaii are actually considered endangered in their native location or homes. And this poses a conflict where if we eradicate these invasive species, they then become extinct. And is that the right decision to make? Another issue is climate change, where with rising temperatures, it's been shown that invasive species will shift ranges upwards in elevation, particularly in Hawaii. This can be a concern regarding, for example, avian mosquitoes that affect bird populations. So if they keep moving upwards in elevation, they'll affect the bird populations that live up there. This then causes an uncertainty when it comes to making future long-term decisions about invasive species control. So what is the strategic path forward with all these challenges? What should be considered most important? Based on what I've read and what has been discussed, what's really important is making evidence-based decisions, being able to prioritize species and regions based on impact and which ones to go and control first, being able to prioritize where resources need to be allocated, as well as the involvement and collaboration of leadership from all levels of government. So these are the references that I used to make this presentation. If you guys have any questions, please comment below. Thank you for taking the time to listen.